Good evening. Thank you for being here with us tonight. I want to start by asking you to do something. I want you to go back to a not so distant past, just 2 years ago, to the end of 2022, to those dark winter months. Do you remember that collective chill we felt back then? And I'm not just talking about the weather. I'm talking about that geopolitical fear that ran deep in our bones. Do you remember that video circulating on television and the internet at the time? That strange dystopian commercial released by Russian energy giant Gazprom? You know, the one with the mournful music playing in the background? The camera pans over snowy, frozen European cities. And then a hand, an invisible, powerful hand, turns a valve, slowly, with a creak. And when that valve closed, the needle on the screen dropped to zero, the blue flame went out, and Europe was plunged into darkness. The message that video conveyed was much clearer than any diplomatic note or any United Nations speech. You will freeze. Remember those arrogant winter days when Vladimir Putin threatened to freeze all of Europe. Remember that great blackmail, especially targeting Germany, saying that without Russian gas and oil, European industry would collapse like a house of cards. That was the moment Putin felt most powerful. He held the energy valve like a gun pressed to Europe's temple. And let's be honest, many of us wondered, could he really do it? Would we sit in our homes wearing coats? Will our factories stop? That was the power of fear. But the story I want to tell you tonight is not the story of that fear. What I want to tell you tonight is the story of what happened to that gun. Because today, as we look toward the end of 2024, that gun is gone. That blackmail has officially failed. But that's not the truly astonishing part. The real story is that the weapon wasn't just broken. It turned around and was pointed back at its owner, Vladimir Putin himself. And the trigger wasn't pulled by the Western democracies, whom Putin saw as his soft underbelly, but by the physical reality created by his own arrogance. I want you to think about this. Putin's energy gateway to Europe, that trust bridge built over decades, consisting of billions of dollars in pipelines, diplomatic handshakes, and champagne glasses, is no longer just closed. That bridge was dynamited by the Europeans themselves, and metaphorically speaking, blown up in Putin's face. And now, as the dust settles, what we see is the wreckage of Russia's entire energy empire lying beneath that bridge. Tonight, we will look at exactly what remains under this wreckage. And believe me, what you will see will surprise you, because this is not just an economic loss. This is a massive wave of panic stretching from Berlin to Belgrade, from Sofia to Bucharest. And do you know where we see this panic most clearly? Not on maps, stock market screens, or in meeting rooms in Brussels. We see it in the Balkans, on the shores of the Black Sea, in a city called Burgas. Now, I want you to picture that scene in your mind. This is Bulgaria, the Lukoil Neftochim Burgas refinery, the largest facility in the Balkans. Huge chimneys, miles of pipes, storage tanks. This is Bulgaria's lifeblood. It single-handedly meets 80% of the country's fuel needs. So when the switch is turned off here, Bulgaria stops. Ambulances won't run, police cars won't work, trucks delivering bread to bakeries won't start. But today there is strange activity around that refinery. It's not the workers and tanker drivers you'd normally expect to see. What you see is the military police deployed by the Bulgarian government against this facility on its own soil. Drone defense systems deployed in the area. Imagine that moment. You surround a factory in your own country with military units as if it were enemy territory. Why? Is a terrorist attack expected? Is there intelligence about sabotage? Number. It's a much more complex, much more 21st century situation. To protect its national security, Bulgaria is preparing to nationalize this giant facility owned by the Russians, that old big brother. In other words, it is seizing it. This is not just a factory changing hands, it is the end of an era. In the place where Putin once said, "If I turn off the tap, you'll freeze," the Russian managers at the head of that tap may now be packing their belongings under the watchful eye of Bulgarian police. So how did a country like Bulgaria, historically deeply tied to Russia and completely dependent on it for energy, find the courage, even the necessity, to seize one of Putin's most valuable assets? This is where the incident moves beyond a simple seizure and becomes a continent-wide tension. The answer is not the sudden decision of a minister in Sofia. The answer is not the result of a mistake in Moscow. The answer is a flawless legal trap prepared by a group of lawyers and strategists across the ocean, in Washington, probably in a windowless room. It is a trap that once you fall into it, the more you struggle, the deeper you sink. And this trap forced Putin's most loyal friends in Europe, his Balkan stronghold Serbia, Hungary, everyone, into an impossible choice. Tonight, we will discuss how this trap works, how Putin's energy weapon was dismantled, and its massive destructive ripple effect, from ghost tankers drifting aimlessly in the oceans to the silent factories within Russia. Because this is the story of how a war can be lost without a single bullet being fired on the front lines. So how did we get here? Why did Bulgaria decide to seize one of Putin's greatest assets, that massive refinery? The answer to this question takes us to where the incident ceased to be merely an energy issue and turned into a continent-wide panic. The answer may seem simple: sanctions. But no, that word is too mild. This is a perfectly crafted legal trap set in Washington. And understanding how this trap works is crucial, because it is precisely this mechanism that is currently redrawing Europe's map. This trap is based on a dilemma that forces all European countries, companies, and even Putin's unshakable allies, whom he trusts so much, into an impossible choice. Think of it like a chessboard, but Washington sets the rules. You are presented with two options. There is no third way. There is no luxury of saying, "I'll remain neutral." First option, you can continue to work with Russian companies. You can say, "We have a long-standing friendship with the Russians. We have trade with them." But then the heavy hammer of U.S. sanctions will come down on you. You will commit economic suicide. Your banks will be cut off from the international system. Your credit cards will stop working. Your companies will be blacklisted. In other words, you will be erased from the modern world. Option 2, survive. But survival comes at a price. You must immediately seize, nationalize, or sell Russian assets in your own country. Those massive refineries, pipelines. In other words, you must take Putin's property from Putin. As you can see, it's a terrible choice. But without exception, everyone is choosing the second option. And that's where the so-called domino effect begins. This effect is dismantling Putin's entire European stronghold, that energy empire, brick by brick. The first and perhaps most noisy result of this trap exploded in Bulgaria, considered the weakest link in the European Union. I just told you about the military police around that refinery, the Lukoil facility in Burgas. Now let's put the why question into that picture. For the Sofia government, this was not a choice but a matter of national security. Imagine that 80% of your country's fuel is dependent on a single company, Lukoil. The gasoline you put in your car when you wake up in the morning, the fuel that heats your home, everything. If sanctions are imposed and you do nothing, that refinery shuts down. The country would run out of fuel within weeks. Chaos would ensue, riots would break out, the economy would grind to a halt, governments would fall. So what did the government in Sofia do? This is the part that really struck me. You know how bureaucracy works. Things are cumbersome, they take months, committees are set up, reports are written, but no. According to Balkan Insight reports, do you know how long it took the Bulgarian parliament to pass that critical amendment? At exactly 26 seconds. Yes, you heard right. That law, which changed a country's energy destiny and burned bridges with Russia, passed through the committee in just 26 seconds. This speed tells us something. This speed is not about determination, but rather the speed of pure fear and the instinct to survive. What did this law say? It was very clear. It gave the state the authority to seize the Lukoil refinery and sell it to a new owner. That's why the refinery was surrounded by military police and drone defense systems, as if it were a war zone. Because now that refinery was no longer a company's property, it was the state's ticket to survival. Of course, you wouldn't expect Russia to remain silent about this. Russia's ambassador to Sofia, Eleonora Mitrofanova, spoke to the TASS news agency and said something very interesting. She said, "This looks like a property expropriation law. The Bulgarians are taking a very risky step. They are setting a dangerous precedent." Let's pause here. Please pause for a second. A dangerous precedent? Property rights? A representative of a regime that has destroyed Ukrainian cities and disregards international law is talking about property rights and dangerous precedents in the middle of Europe. I guess that's what they call the irony of history. Yes, Madam Ambassador, you are right. This is a dangerous precedent, but it was not Bulgaria that created this precedent. This precedent was created by Putin himself, who drove his tanks across the borders of a sovereign country. The Bulgarians simply made a choice, Putin's friendship or their own country's fuel security. The answer was hidden in that 26-second vote. Do you know what this situation would show the Russian people if they could see the truth? It would show how Putin's grand strategy can instantly turn even his closest, historically most loyal allies into enemies. Putin's image as a reliable partner is currently being crushed under the boots of the Bulgarian police. But the story doesn't end there. I wish it did. But as I said, this is a domino effect. And turn your head slightly north to the industrial heart of Europe, to Germany. A similar scenario is playing out there. Consider Berlin, the giant Schwedt refinery that supplies 1/5 of the country's fuel supply. Who controlled this facility? The Russian state-owned company, Rosneft. The Germans, with their famous meticulousness, analyzed the situation and came to the same conclusion. We must nationalize this facility. The facility has already been under state administration since 2022, effectively under house arrest. But now they are considering taking permanent control, i.e. transferring the title deed to their name. Why? Because when that trap in Washington takes effect, they fear the facility will suffer a financial paralysis, bringing Germany's industrial machinery to a halt, and look east to Romania. Energy Minister Bogdan Ivan came out and said it clearly. We must take control of Lukoil's Romanian subsidiary, Petrotel Ploiesti. The justification is always the same, to secure the national fuel supply. Can you see the picture? Imagine the lights turning on one by one on the map in your mind. Bulgaria, Germany, Romania. These are not isolated incidents. They are a chain reaction triggered simultaneously by the same legal trap. All of them are seizing Russian assets. The energy fortress that Putin has been weaving in Europe for decades is being completely destroyed, not by an external attack, but by its own structural collapse. But wait. The real dramatic rupture is not in this wave of seizures. The real rupture is happening in the countries seen as Putin's Trojan horses in Europe, Slovakia and Hungary, and of course that trapped, helpless country in the Balkans, Serbia. This trap didn't just mobilize enemies, it also turned friends against each other. In a moment, we'll talk about how those friends panicked, why credit cards stopped working in Serbia, and how Putin's most loyal ally found itself cornered. Because that's where the real tragedy lies. Now, I want to pause for a moment and take you on a brief detour from the main story. A journey through the dusty pages of history. Think of the Cold War era, the 1950s, the 60s. Back then, the world was sharply divided into two. The Iron Curtain was not just a metaphor. It was a physical, impassable barrier. Do you remember what it meant to be a satellite state back then? You had to orbit Moscow. Your economy, your military power, even what you were allowed to think were determined by that center. If you tried to break free from that orbit, like Hungary in 1956 or Prague in 1968, tanks would roll in. But even that era had a logic, a twisted security pact. In exchange for loyalty, you received protection and cheap energy. Now let's return to the present, to 2024. Putin's tragedy lies here. He still believes he can rule the world with this 1950s logic, with that old satellite state system. But the world has changed. Even if the tanks don't come, something much more terrifying is coming: financial isolation. And this isolation is hitting not Putin's enemies, but his friends, whom he sees as his fortress. The most dramatic scene in this story is currently playing out in the heart of the Balkans, in Serbia. Think of Serbia, Putin's last loyal friend in Europe. Historical ties, Slavic brotherhood, Orthodox unity. Every time Putin looked at Belgrade, he saw an unshakable ally. But what happened when that legal trap in Washington kicked in? The situation of Serbia's national oil company, NIS, Naftna Industrija Srbije, has turned into a modern tragedy. Who owns the majority stake in the company? Russian giants Gazprom and Gazprom Neft. Normally, this would be a show of strength. But in this new world, it became a death sentence. I want to take you to a gas station in Belgrade. It's an ordinary Tuesday. You pull up, fill up your tank, you go to the cashier and take that shiny plastic card, your Visa or MasterCard, out of your pocket. You swipe it through the POS terminal, and you hear that sound. Beep, beep, declined. You try again, beep, beep. The problem isn't your balance. The problem isn't your card. The problem is this. Because that gas station is Russian-owned, the global financial system has cut it off. Visa and MasterCard have suspended transactions at NIS and Gazprom stations in Serbia. According to BBC reporters, 1 in 10 customers, especially foreigners, are left stranded without being able to pay. Can you imagine? In the middle of the 21st century, in the heart of Europe, your credit card doesn't work in your own country just because you're trying to remain loyal to your leader, Putin. Serbia's drama doesn't end there. Serbia is a landlocked country with no access to the sea. Where does it get its oil? from a pipeline that runs through Croatia, the Janaf pipeline. But what happened when the sanctions kicked in? Croatia turned off the tap. Sorry, they said. If the buyer is Gazprom, no oil will pass through us. Serbian Energy Minister Dubravka Đedović-Handanović came out and said, "Our time is running out. Stocks could run out by the end of November." You could hear the desperation in his voice. And at that moment, that historic loyalty agreement collapsed. What do you think Serbian President Vučić did in that predicament? Did he call Moscow? No, he called Ukrainian leader Zelensky. Yes, you heard correctly. Putin's biggest ally in the Balkans met with the leader Putin is fighting against in order to survive. And then he sent this signal to the European Commission. We may change our decision to reject sanctions against Russia. The words of the Serbian energy minister actually sum up this whole process. NIS's stake may be insignificant for Gazprom, but for Serbia, it means everything. Meaning, we are sinking here because of your imperial dreams, and we will no longer sink. This is the moment when Putin's influence in Europe ended. It is the moment when he pushed his own allies into the arms of the West with his own hands. So what did Putin say? If Europe is finished, so be it. We will turn our faces to the East. Asia is waiting for us. You remember, at the beginning of the war, everyone was saying this. China and India will swallow Russian oil. Putin will not suffer. It made sense on paper. But real life does not always follow plans on paper. Right now, when you look at the oceans, the vast waters of the world, you see a strange, ghostly fleet. We call it the shadow fleet. Uninsured, unidentified, decrepit tankers. Do you know what's in those tankers right now? A full 380 million barrels of unsold Russian oil drifting aimlessly across the oceans. There are no buyers. Let's look at Putin's great savior, China. According to Bloomberg data, China's state-owned refineries, Sinopec, PetroChina, have halted Russian oil purchases. Why? Because they fear Western sanctions. Smaller refineries don't want to take the risk either. Russian ESPO crude oil is being boycotted. What about India, Russia's old friend? Indians aren't sentimental, they're traders. They were buying Russian oil because it was cheap. But what happened when sanctions tightened? Giants like Reliance Industries suspended purchases. And do you know what's the most painful part? Who is filling Russia's void in the Indian market? Saudi Arabia. Putin's OPEC partner stepped in to close the gap. Russian oil is currently being sold at a loss, $20 below Brent crude. Russian censors are even trying to remove these prices from the news. And let's look right under our noses at Turkey. Turkey is also quietly changing course. Tüpraş has started reducing Russian oil and buying from Brazil and Angola. The Star refinery, owned by Azerbaijan's SOCAR, has cut Russian oil and turned to Iraq and Kazakhstan. Why? Because everyone sees the same thing. Russian oil is no longer fuel, it's toxic waste. Anyone who touches it gets burned. Putin's "if the West won't take it, the East will" plan has been shattered by the harsh market realities of Asia. This is not just the end of a trade deal. It is the portrait of a superpower becoming a global pariah, an unwanted man. So who pays the price for being this unwanted man? Those sitting at the long tables in the Kremlin? Number? The price is paid by the people in Russia's vast steppes, in towns whose names are unheard of. In the final part, we will focus on those people, on the silent cry of the Monotowns, and on the philosophical conclusion of this story, because that is where the real destruction lies. The European fortress has fallen. The much-trusted Eastern market has closed its doors. The so-called allies were the first to abandon ship. So when the smoke clears and the noise dies down, what remains? What is the final tally? And more importantly, who is paying that bill? I want to take our story off that grand geopolitical chessboard and bring it down to human stories, to Russia's seemingly endless, gray, and increasingly silent landscape. Because those terms we hear in the news bulletins, export revenues have fallen, barrel prices have plummeted. These are abstract concepts, they are just numbers. But behind those numbers are lives destroyed, homes extinguished, and a future stolen. To understand this, we first need to look at the oceans, that boundless blue expanse. Remember that shadow fleet we mentioned earlier? Right now, 380 million barrels of Russian oil are drifting aimlessly across the world's seas, loaded onto uninsured, flagless, rusty tankers. And I want you to visualize that number, 380 million barrels. This is not just unsellable goods. It is a massive fortune trapped in the middle of the ocean, impossible to convert into cash. And those barrels don't just contain oil. Do you know what else is in those barrels? The Russian people's pensions. It's the heating bill for a hospital in Siberia. It's the asphalt for the roads, the chalk for the schools, the salaries for the teachers. From the very first day he came to power, Vladimir Putin offered his people an implicit, unwritten, but universally understood contract. That contract was, don't get involved in politics, don't question democracy, freedoms, or the palaces. In return, I will offer you stability financed by oil and gas money. Your refrigerator will be full, your home will be warm. Today, that social contract, along with those 380 million barrels of oil, is drifting like a ghost in the middle of the ocean. Oil cannot be sold, money is not coming in, and the contract is being unilaterally terminated. This economic cancer is no longer just visible as red lines on the Moscow Stock Exchange screens. This cancer has metastasized and spread to the industrial heart of Russia, to the provinces. In Russia, there is a special term that sociologists and economists know very well: monotown, monogorod. What is a monotown? These are cities that are tied to a single industry, often a single giant factory, like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Tula. Life in these cities begins with the factory whistle in the morning and ends with that whistle in the evening. Everyone in the city either works at the factory or sells bread to those who do. The factory is the heart of the city. So what happens when Russia can't sell its oil? What happens when the state coffers are empty? The state subsidies that keep those factories running are cut off because the war economy is like a voracious monster. War begins to devour the civilian economy. We call this cannibalization in economics. To produce tanks, you cut off the electricity to the refrigerator factory. The result? The reports coming out of those cities right now are chilling. Do you know what the factories are doing? They're declaring mandatory unpaid vacations. What an innocent name, isn't it? Vacation. But it's not a vacation, it's a disaster. Production lines are halted, and tens of thousands of workers wake up one morning and realize they don't need to go to work. They have no money in their pockets. Winter is coming, and that familiar smoke isn't rising from the factory. This silence, believe me, it's far more terrifying than the sound of artillery on the front lines, because this situation creates a lost generation. When those factories shut down, the skills and expertise those workers have acquired over the years become worthless. This situation is fueling the rise of alcoholism, crime, domestic violence, and most importantly, a silent but deep volcanic anger toward the regime in the Russian provinces. Putin promised his people a great and strong Russia. The West envies us, he said. But look at the picture he presents to them today. A country that even its closest allies, Serbia and Hungary, flee to avoid being seen as contagious. An economy buried under the ruins of his much-trusted energy empire. And a divided, impoverished, isolated society. And do you know where the most tragic, most philosophical dimension of this lies? While the people pay this price with empty refrigerators and a darkening future, their leaders live in a completely different reality behind the high walls of the Kremlin, in an echo chamber, in a loneliness where they hear no sound but their own. Where did we see the most striking, most ironic example of this? In the South Caucasus. Consider Azerbaijan, the place Putin has called his backyard and sphere of influence for years. What is the Azerbaijani army doing right now? Officially, it is openly abandoning Russian and Soviet military standards and transitioning to NATO standards. Azerbaijani President Aliyev receives a NATO delegation and discusses integration with the Turkish army. So Russia's biggest nightmare is happening on its border. So what is Russian Defense Minister Shoigu saying on the same days? The situation in the South Caucasus has become much more stable. This is largely thanks to Russia's efforts. Please think about this sentence for a second. If your roof is on fire, your neighbors are packing their belongings and moving to the other side, to your enemy. But you look out the window and say, everything is so wonderful. We have brought such beautiful stability here. This is not a simple propaganda lie. This is a disconnect from reality. It is proof that a regime has lost its ability to perceive the outside world and is trapped in its own simulation. Putin and his entourage are lost in the echo chamber they have created. Putin's propaganda blares on television morning and night. We are at war with the West. The whole world is attacking us. But the data, those silent factories, those ghost tankers rotting in the ocean, and neighbors rushing to NATO, they scream a completely different truth, a much more painful truth. The whole world is not attacking you. The whole world is running away from you. That is the difference. You fight against an attack. You can fight an enemy. But what can you do against flight? What weapon can you use against loneliness? Putin's arrogance that the West needs us, his blackmail that if I turn off the energy tap, they'll freeze. All of it has failed. That energy weapon turned into a boomerang and hit its owner. Now, when we look at the wreckage of that bridge, what we see is not just an economic crisis. It is the dramatic end of an era, the end of the energy superpower myth. As I close the program, I want to leave you with this thought. History shows us this: reality ultimately defeats even the most powerful propaganda. The laws of physics always defeat political rhetoric. If oil isn't sold, money doesn't come in. If money doesn't come in, cities grind to a halt. If cities grind to a halt, that's when empires collapse with a sigh. Russia is experiencing that sigh right now. Thank you for joining us tonight in examining the anatomy of this collapse. We will continue to monitor the effects of this legal trap and global flight, because this story is not over. It is just entering its darkest chapter. Keep thinking, keep questioning. Good night.